Hello and welcome to the Global Perspective Show. I'm John Bercia, Special Assistant to the President for Global Perspectives at the University of Central Florida. Our guest today is William Powers, who is a Senior Fellow at the World Policy Institute in New York and is an Environmental Policy Specialist. Thanks for joining us.
Yes, thanks for having me, John.
Tell us how you got into your line of work. What inspired you to move in this direction, and maybe a little bit about some of the adventures you've had along the way.
Well, I'll tell you, it's interesting. My parents were actually a priest and a nun.
Oh my gosh.
And so I grew up in a household that had a lot of sort of ethical values and so on. Their eyes met over a communion wafer, I like to say. And they had my sister and I after getting married. And my middle name is actually Daniel, from Daniel Berrigan, a friend of theirs, an activist. So I think as I grew up in the environmental era, I became more interested in what we're doing to the planet in terms of global warming, rainforest destruction, and so on. Well, after graduate school at Georgetown, I received a phone call one day from Catholic Relief Services, and they offered me a position in Liberia. Well, I didn't even know where Liberia was on the map. I had to go and Google it and look it up. But I ended up accepting that job over a World Bank position and State Department. USAID
And not the traditional
jobs.
path then.
It wasn't the traditional path, no, but it just seemed exciting, and it was one of the frontiers of anarchy, the places where the Pandora's box has been opened and can hardly be closed, you know. These are the fourth world countries that are environmentally looted and also politically unstable. So it was quite an adventure. You know, I went off and I was managing a huge food program over there, 150 staff, lots of field offices, 24-hour-a-day radio contact. You know, it was a total change in lifestyle from how I grew up on suburban Long Island. But I learned a lot there. I saw how one timber company, the Oriental Timber Company, was just taking out the entire Liberian rainforest. And they were assisted by Charles Taylor. He's the dictator now on trial in The Hague for war crimes in Sierra Leone mostly. 22 counts, including sexual slavery. And we were operating this large program under his dictatorship.
So how long were you in Liberia altogether?
I was in Liberia for over 2 years. That was during the heart of the Civil War from 1999 to 2001.
But in light of that, were you able to carry out your work as effectively as you had hoped, or were you always being frustrated by the obstacles you faced in this environment of conflict?
Well, I'll tell you, I had many sleepless nights, and I was held at gunpoint by a child soldier at one point. I can tell you other things, but I probably
That's fine.
But it was very, very difficult. But luckily, the people in Liberia were so inspiring. For example, Chief Wa in the south, he established a community forest with us, and he personally and his community defended that forest from these illegal loggers. And that gave me hope, because we were able to work with these communities to establish land tenure over their areas. And that acted as a kind of a bulwark against this expansionist global capitalism that was tied in with this dictatorship in Liberia. And then I went back to Liberia end of last year, and I'll tell you, it was a miracle that it happened. Taylor's gone. Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, the first woman president of Africa, is at the helm, and she's doing wonders. She passed Executive Order Number 1, which you probably heard of, where she canceled all logging contracts, including OTC, of course, and she set up a process. And now every single tree coming out of Liberia has to have a little barcode on it, where it's traced from the stump to the ship by a European monitoring firm. So even the more radical environmental groups have certified that all of Liberia's timber is legal. And it's bringing more income to the country because they can sell the certified timber at a premium price.
Now, did you go to visit that community forest you had worked with?
Well, I couldn't make it back there this time, but I've heard that they're still preserving that area.
Oh, good, good. So you left Liberia, and what was the next adventure?
Well, I left Liberia and was transferred actually to Bolivia, in the landlocked heart of South America. It's about 70% Andes and more like 70% Amazon and 30% Andes.
And you had language skills to help you in this environment?
Yes, well, I speak Spanish. I don't speak the indigenous languages, which are Aymara, Quechua, and Guarani, but you can get by with Spanish. And so we worked on the world's largest Kyoto Protocol rainforest experiment. It was the Nullkemp Climate Action Project. It's a beautiful area. John, if you can imagine these stunning rainforests, it was the inspiration for the Lost World. 20 waterfalls just crashing out of the Huanchaca Mesa into these virgin jungles. But this area, unfortunately, was going to be cut down, again, by logging companies. What we did was we worked with some multinational companies to buy out the logging concessions of 5 different companies. And we turned that area back over to Mother Nature. And today, if you go back to Liberia, it's still there. There's still that 3 million acres. And it's still there because of market mechanisms, because of what we call carbon ranching. Those companies actually earn Kyoto Protocol voluntary credits towards conserving that area. And those are traded on the Chicago Climate Exchange. And it's the philosophy that if it pays, it stays. So by giving it a monetized value, the forest has an existence value that it never had before. So it was a very exciting project. So exciting, in fact, that now it's been adopted by the architects of the Copenhagen Protocol. And I'll be off in Copenhagen supporting this issue in December. And it looks like it's going to go gangbusters, if you will. And
that was going to be my next question. What were your expectations for Copenhagen?
Well, in terms of the forest issue, I'm very optimistic. I was at a high-level meeting at the UN last month where there were 12 heads of state there, plus the Secretary General, and everyone is in support of it, from the African Union to the EU, even the US. Everyone wants to do this. What do they want to do? They want to save the world's final rainforests for their role in sequestering carbon dioxide. So I'm hoping that not only will they pass strict targets for emissions in Copenhagen, I'd like to see it capped at about 350 parts per million of CO2 as the outmost limit, or about 2 degrees Celsius above 1990 levels, and having binding targets to how to get there, not just suggested schedules that are monitored. So that's for overall emissions. For forests, I'm really going to be there pushing for saving all of the world's last rainforests and really getting the political will behind this so that they can continue to save the atmosphere by locking up tons of carbon every day.
I think the average viewer, I'm sure, knows why the rainforests are important, but if you could summarize for us, what would happen if they didn't exist anymore? What would be the loss to the planet, to humanity, et cetera, et cetera?
It's a great question and an important one. I mean, the rainforests, of course, are the lungs of the earth. They breathe in carbon dioxide and breathe out oxygen, the same oxygen that we breathe. But they also harbor species, a vast array of life. Unfortunately, we're losing several species a day, and that can be, of course, held back by preserving their habitat, which is the rainforest. They also provide all kinds of medicines and potential cures for cancer and other diseases that we haven't even identified. The majority of species in the rainforest have not yet been recorded by science. There's a whole vast frontier there.
So we don't even know what we might be destroying.
Exactly. And of course, human beings live in these forests.
Is there a rough estimate of how many human beings live in these rainforests? Because I've seen some numbers, but they're all over the place.
Right. There are something like 7,000 languages left on the planet, if you'll believe it. It's a very diverse area. So we're talking about a loss of half of those in the next 30 to 40 years. So we're losing about a tongue every fortnight, you might say. But I think that cultural diversity, and most of those exist in the rainforest because like species diversity, it gets thicker towards the equator, so does cultural diversity. So you have more and more tribes and different groups who speak different small languages near the equator. Every time one of those groups goes extinct, well, we become less robust as a human race, right? Because the species is strengthened by all different responses, especially now in the age of global warming when some of those groups have some real answers for the crises that we face.
Now, what will happen to them as we go through different phases of climate change? Many of them will be displaced, I would imagine. We've already seen this happening in some places.
Sure. Well, I met a woman last month, Ursula. She's from Papua New Guinea, and she's the 5th or 6th generation of matrilineal inheritance in her tribe a beautiful woman. But unfortunately, because sea level rise due to global warming, Ursula and her 3,000 neighbors are going underwater. It's already happening. So you might say they're the first real climate refugees. Luckily, she was a real leader, and she pressured her government to giving them some safe, high ground in another island in Papua New Guinea. But this land that's been in her family for all that time is now gone.
Do you feel the average person is aware that these things are happening? I saw recently the cabinet of the Maldive Islands held their meeting underwater in scuba gear
exactly,
to emphasize this development. But some people are entertained by that. Some people don't really understand what they're doing. But yeah, there are some countries that are facing catastrophic possibilities as we speak.
Yes, yes. And entire peoples. You know, I actually shook hands with the final woman who speaks the Watasue language in the Bolivian Amazon. She's the last speaker. You know, anthropologists talk about the last speaker, you know. And I met her, and my friend had been to the last Watasue wedding. After that, there's not enough big enough gene pool to keep producing. But this woman, she told me, you know, after me, this is it. My people are going into extinction. And if you can just think about that, what that would mean to have
What did you say to her?
You know, I just held her hand, and her hands had these veins like a rough root of a kamara tree, and I just didn't know what to say. I basically teared up. You know, there's nothing you can do. Originally, we had an activity in our program, part of this big climate change program, to try to rescue that culture from extinction, but I realized it was hopeless. So that's the fate for a lot of tribes. Luckily, you know, other tribes have seen what's happened to the Watasue, and they're trying to avoid that fate. So a lot of the ones who were fighting for this carbon ranching project were able to, you know, think locally and act globally. To reverse a 60s slogan, they were able to unite with some of these multinational companies and jump above corrupt bureaucracies in their own countries to save their land. And now they're thriving. I mean, there's several thousand of these Chiquitanos who are continuing to practice their culture, to live in the forest and so on, because now they have their land.
What do you say to the critics of intervention in these kinds of situations who maintain that you know, you can't save everybody, and some cultures are just destined to be gone from the planet, and if there's conflict in a given area, well, let it burn itself out because we don't have enough resources to deal with everything. I mean, these are the people who always come back and challenge you when you try to help people in these kinds of circumstances. What is your response to them?
Well, I don't think it's a zero-sum game. I think in a sense we need to think about shared prosperity and living together on this planet. And to just say that, oh, it's okay for us to indulge in certain economic activities that destroy these forests where these people live, well, you know, I just can't really ethically accept that position. So we work to educate people about this. There are groups like Cultural Survival and others that work on this full-time. And also try to create models, economic models, where it pays for these places to stay. We're trying to wire into global capitalism the existence value of these spaces so that people can continue to live there for a long time.
Mm-hmm. So to continue, when did you come to the World Policy Institute?
I came to the World Policy Institute late last year.
Okay, so this is very recent.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
And what drew you to that organization?
Well, they're working on the same type of issues that I am. You know, they look to shared global prosperity, towards seeking collective solutions because these are collective problems. And so they're pushing now a green agenda because that's one of these collective solutions. And so they brought me on board in order to lead their green agenda. So I've been working with a white paper on the European Union Liberia trade agreement for tropical timber, which I helped set up, and trying to look at the lessons learned from that and get it out there to a wider public because it's an exciting example.
Oh, is that finished or?
That's in progress. That should be appearing in December or January. And I also just did a piece with the research assistant at the World Policy Institute on carbon ranching and what needs to happen in Copenhagen in terms of that issue. So those are the kinds of things that we're interested in. We're also pushing to get multi-stakeholder dialogues between indigenous people, governments, and private sector in the Latin American countries around supporting a robust forest carving regime.
So what is your next adventure or foreign trip?
Well, tonight I leave for Bolivia, and I'll be down there writing an article on the Bolivian rainforest for the German National Geographic magazine, Geo, and doing another consultancy down there as well. And then, of course, I'll be in Copenhagen. And after that, we'll see. Lots of possibilities out there.
What are your thoughts regarding the sort of intermediate and long term for humanity in terms of climate change and all the other forces that we seem to be dealing with in a very, very uncertain world?
Mm-hmm.
Are you optimistic, pessimistic? Do you sense that people are interested, engaged, committed, willing to help? And how do we mobilize them so that there is the right effort made in dealing with these various issues?
I do read the surveys, and I realize that only 36% of Americans surveyed believe that humans are having an impact on climate. That's an incredibly low number. It's gone down from, I think, 45% a couple of years ago. That's disturbing. At the same time, I just see such an upwelling of activism around climate change like I've never seen before. One is the 350.org movement, headed by Bill McKibben. There's also the Tick, Tick, Tick network, the clock ticking towards Copenhagen, and so many other people around the world fighting this. I heard that there were something like 1 million civil society groups, NGOs, citizen groups around the world. It's like these little points of sparks of light around the world, you know. So I'm somewhat hopeful. I really am. And as I've seen in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, and even in my work in Native North America, there are just people in these more vulnerable societies that are most affected by climate change, who are also not causing the problem, but who aren't playing games of guilt or shame and blame, but are looking for pragmatic solutions and doing some of these things that I've been talking about.
You've written some popular books. Is there another book project in the works that you can talk about, or?
Yes, actually, well, my new book is called 12 by 12. It'll be appearing in April. And that book is a little different from my previous books on international relations. That's looking at my own country. I returned back to the States after about a decade of working abroad, looking for solutions to some of these problems, and ended up, by a series of coincidences, living for 6 weeks in a small 12 by 12 foot house in North Carolina. It's owned by a rather charismatic physician down there who only accepts $12,000 salary each year, and she gives the rest back because she wants to live simply, even in the heart of the United States. So she's got a permaculture farm. She grows her own food, harvests her rainwater off the roof, and all of her neighbors are permaculturists and biofuel brewers and organic agriculturists supporting urban centers in Raleigh, Durham, Chapel Hill with their products.
Now, describe for us a 12 by 12 house, because that's a typical room you'd find.
Right,
in
it's like
someone's
an apartment in my native New York City.
Yeah.
No, it's even smaller than that. I'm 6 feet tall, so it's twice my height, and I just do that twice and twice. So it's very small, but she's got a small loft above with her bed, and you know, she's a single person, so it's really the space you need. And she says that she wakes up with tears of joy most mornings just to be without electricity, so close to nature, and to these wonderful, like 200 heirloom plants that she's growing and the river flowing by. So I think for her, it's a kind of a spiritual journey, let's just say. And also it's an experiment in what it's like to live on the margins or the creative edge of our society at this time, and how we can minimize our impact and maximize our joy. And it's not for everyone. I mean, like
you lived there for how long?
I only was there for 6 weeks.
6 weeks.
I was tiny house sitting for her.
Now, were you initially ill at ease, or did you like it from the beginning? Or
I was shocked. The first
okay.
time I saw it, she invited me in, and I didn't want to step inside. I said, something inside me screamed out for something bigger and more American. And but then once I stepped inside, it was surprisingly roomy. I sat down in her great-grandmother's chair in there and just realized that it is a lot of space. And really, you know what it is? It's like there's 10,000 12 by 12s of nature around it, let's say. So that's really her living space, you know. So by having a small space, you don't have to fill it with a lot of stuff. In fact, a lot of European architects and designers are experimenting with small, think small, for that reason. So it simplifies your life, and you're able to spend more time in nature.
Mm-hmm. So the book, just in a few sentences, can you share what that's going to be about?
Well, I'm looking at people living on this creative edge, not just in North Carolina, and not just living in 12 by 12s, but around the world. So I bring in stories from Asia, from Africa, from people that I've met who are living sustainably in different ways, in very different ways, but in ways which are, I think, responsive to the 21st century, the environmental era. So I share those stories, and it's also a bit of a personal memoir in the sense that I'm going into this 12 by 12 and I just have all these experiences, like what do you do with your waste? Where do you get your water? How do you cook? All of these things you have to, it's like a childlike moment where you're trying to figure out all these things, And so it was a very engaging experience.
What are your plans long term? Do you intend to continue working with think tanks, organizations of that type that work on policy issues, or do you have aspirations to do something else? Do you plan to continue living here, or do you anticipate you'll be living in another country for an extended period of time again?
It's possible. There was a possibility of going to Afghanistan. In fact, they were asking me to go over there to do something, which I don't think I'm going to do. Well, I've been doing a lot of public speaking around the country, sharing my experiences with audiences of different kinds, writing articles, op-eds, essays, working on this new book. So I think really the way the trajectory going is to try to participate more in my own country. I've been abroad for 10 years, learning these lessons, trying to develop skills and try to reach out and be on the ground with these people in different countries. And now I'm trying to bring the lessons home. And that's why I'm at the World Policy Institute, because to bring these things to scale, you kind of have to reach into the opinion leaders of the United States and the wealthy countries. So in some ways, it's a time in my life where I want to be in that realm.
And do you feel that people generally are receptive to these issues compared to how they might have been 10 years ago or 20 years ago when you were just getting into this?
Definitely, much more. Even since I arrived here in Orlando, I've been speaking with the taxi drivers and others here, and everyone seems to know about climate change, and I'm amazed actually at how maybe part of the work you've been doing in the community and others has been building awareness. And I found that around the country. I've been recently in San Diego and Portland and Ann Arbor and Vermont and all over the place. And everywhere I go, there's much more awareness than there was 10, 20 years ago.
Mm-hmm. What advice would you offer to a young person who is getting ready to graduate in this very difficult economic environment, and what he or she might do that would really benefit the planet?
I would say follow your bliss, to quote Joseph Campbell in those famous Bill Moyers interviews. Follow your bliss. If you come alive, you will bring others more to life. And find out what you love to do and what you feel like is your gift, and do that very well, and it will create unintended consequences. I would say don't worry about the so-called crisis. I realize that there is a financial crisis, but I think that if you really see things as a blue ocean, in other words, an ocean of possibility, rather than a red ocean, a place where everything is in competition and there's blood in the water and everything like that. Look at it as abundance, and they'll be successful.
And this is obviously advice you follow.
Maybe subconsciously, but I think it probably is, yes.
Okay, well, on that note, well, thank you very much, Mr. Powers, for joining us today.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. And thank you for the Global Perspective Show. I'm John Bercia, and we'll see you next time.